Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. We'll be going through a series of tips for how to improve your symptoms of ADHD and a little bit in what causes ADHD in terms of diet and lifestyle. So we'll get started with the presentation now. So the first thing we're going to talk about is from a study in Australia, associations between healthy and Western dietary patterns and other covariables with ADHD diagnosis by age 14 years old. So these are some things that are associated with ADHD and linked with coming down with a case of ADHD. So the first thing, well, there's Model 1 and Model 2. And Model 1 is if you have that variable. Model 2 is if you have that variable, but it tries to correct for all of the other covariables that are related to the variable. So Model 2 tries to isolate the one variable. Model 1 leaves the variable there with all of its connections uncorrected for with all the other variables. Model 1 does correct with being a boy, and Model 2 corrects with being a boy and all the other variables. So there is some correction in Model 1. The first thing here we'll look at is a healthy dietary pattern. So if you eat healthy, and those who eat healthy according to this have an increased chance of ADHD. 1.09 times in Model 1 and 1.02 times in Model 2. So it's only a 9% difference. The other diet they looked at is Western dietary pattern. And this had a 2.24 times a effect. So having a Western dietary pattern increased your chances of getting ADHD by 2.24 times, or 2.21 times when corrected for. And that was statistically significant. I'll just go ahead here and show you what the healthy diet consisted of and what the Western diet consisted of. The healthy diet had yellow or red vegetables, leafy green vegetables, tomatoes, cruciferous vegetables, other vegetables, fresh fruit, legumes, whole grains, and fish. It was high in those. And the other things didn't weigh as highly in it. So the healthy diet looked at how much healthy foods you ate, but not so much on how much unhealthy foods you didn't eat. But the Western diet pattern in this study, which was linked to that 2.24 times increase in ADHD, the Western dietary pattern was high in takeaway foods, confectionery, sweets, red meat, refined grains, processed meats, potato, fried, for example, French fries, crisp, soft drinks, cakes and biscuits, potatoes that were not fried, sauces and dressings, and full-fat dairy products. So you can see the loads were significant for processed food in the Western dietary pattern that was linked to getting ADHD, while eating more healthy foods was not necessarily linked, but if you're eating healthy foods, that indicates you're not eating the ultra-processed foods, which explains why the healthy diet had much lower odds ratio of ADHD. So child gender. Male children had 3.93 times increased risk of getting ADHD. Pregnancy variables. Maternal age at conception didn't really affect it. Maternal education didn't really affect it. Smoking during pregnancy had a slight effect, but when corrected for, it was only an 18% effect. A biological father living with the family, having no biological father around, was doubled your odds of ADHD, and when corrected for, it was a 67% increase. Family income. So this is actually a measure of the poverty line in Australia. So if you were below the poverty line, you had a 1.48 times increased risk of getting ADHD, but when you correct for the other variables, like if they didn't eat junk food and other things, there was actually a decreased risk of ADHD. So if you reduce some of these other things and you're poor, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get ADHD. Maternal stress events. So if while pregnant you had 3 or more stressful events, that increased it by 1.74 times or 2.05 times when corrected for. Lifestyle variables. Physical activity. If you were physically active 2 to 6 times or 7+ times a week, you had half the chance of getting ADHD, and that was even greater when correcting for other variables. Sedentary activity. If you just sit around all day, 2 to 4 hours wasn't that much of an issue. It actually led to a decreased risk of ADHD. But if you sat around for more than 4 hours a day, that was associated with a slight increased risk of only 1%. Family income. The earlier family income was for the poverty line. These are more middle class people. So if you were lower middle class, you had less chance of ADHD. If you were middle class, you had the lowest chance of ADHD at almost 1/3 the risk. And if you were wealthy, you had a slightly increased risk of ADHD, especially when correcting for other variables. Single parent families had a slight 28% increased chance of getting ADHD. So you can see some of the biggest things here are a Western dietary pattern, being a guy, biological father present or absent, and stress during the pregnancy, and things that really reduced your chances of getting ADHD were physical activity, not sitting around all day, being middle class, and there was a slight effect from being in a single parent family. So here's the pattern, healthy or Western diet. We looked at that already. Now we're going to look up some of the things you can do, some of the supplements you can take, some of the changes you can make that improve your symptoms of ADHD. So if you can't concentrate and you're always on the go, maybe try some of these things. And if you view ADHD as a negative in your life, you can correct it by doing some of these interventions. First thing I'll mention is krill oil. Fish oil also works likely, but it's slightly less good than krill oil. But I wouldn't hesitate to substitute fish oil instead of krill oil, or instead of substituting fish oil, you can just eat some herring or some sardines or some small oily fish, and that would lead to this improvement also. So patients who were on krill oil improved their ability to concentrate by an average of 60% after taking it daily. 500 milligrams daily for 6 months of krill oil. A 60% improvement, a 70% improvement is the improvement on Ritalin. So a 60% improvement is almost as good as taking Ritalin. They also reported a 50% improvement in planning skills and a close to 49% improvement in social skills. So krill oil, fish oil, or eating fish is one way you can impact and change and improve your symptoms of ADHD. Next thing I'll talk about is magnesium. A lot of people are deficient in magnesium, and 72% of ADHD kids were found to be deficient in magnesium. In those who were deficient, so if they were deficient, supplementing led to a 70% improvement. So it was as effective as Ritalin to take some magnesium if you were magnesium deficient. And it's often a good idea to supplement magnesium for various reasons. But additionally, you can consider adding B6. Vitamin B6 helps utilize the magnesium, and it may increase the helpful effects. But just taking magnesium by itself might be a good way to go if you are magnesium deficient and have ADHD. The next thing I'll talk about is zinc. In a recent study, 70% of the 20 ADHD people studied in this study were zinc deficient. Those with lower hair zinc levels reported significantly increased symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So in another study, 43 ADHD children, 30% had a severe zinc deficiency versus 0% of the 28 children who were control children who did not have ADHD. So if you would like to consider taking some zinc, zinc may really improve your symptoms of ADHD or your child's symptoms of ADHD. So you can give them 25 milligrams of zinc or however much zinc you think is appropriate for their age, and that may improve their symptoms of ADHD. Next thing you do is saffron. So saffron is often added to rice for its subtle flavor, but saffron helps ADHD as much as Ritalin. So it's a 70% reduction, and you can buy saffron online or at a health food store. They sometimes have it, or at a fine food store. But basically taking 20 to 30 milligrams per day effectively managed your symptoms of, or your child's symptoms of ADHD. So taking saffron is, it's cheaper than Ritalin, I believe, and it's also just as effective. Some other things you can do is walking in nature for 20 minutes. So going for a walk in nature was as effective as Ritalin, but it was measured right after the walk. And it was only measured doing one test they use for testing ADHD. So it's unclear if the benefits persist for how long after the walk, but if you remember, the first graph we looked at had physical activity and sedentary activity and how it relates to ADHD, and you saw there that being active physically and not being too sedentary really improved your chances of not getting ADHD. So getting active and not being too sedentary are two lifestyle changes you can make, or that will probably wallop your ADHD symptoms away. Another thing which is again associated with activities is something called hippotherapy, which is horse therapy. And I know Dr. Phil often sends people to the ranch. Misbehaving kids go to the ranch. So there is a study showing that horse therapy or hippotherapy is slightly more effective than Ritalin in controlling your symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So getting out of the house and enriching yourself, I would speculate that joining a sports team or getting involved in a nature group or something would also be highly effective. The next thing I'll mention is gut bacteria. They can affect ADHD symptoms, and they can also affect the response to treatment. So if you have treatment resistance ADHD, this might be explain some of that resistance to treatment. Harmful bacteria include Clostridium and Candida. So probiotics might help, and less sugar in the case of Candida might help reduce your chances of getting ADHD or reduce your symptoms of ADHD. The next thing I'll mention is phosphotidylserine. It led to a 30% reduction in children's ADHD symptoms at 200 milligrams a day. So it's not very effective compared to the other things we've talked about, but it's another thing you can potentially do to reduce your symptoms of ADHD. Better sleep might help. There were a couple studies about sleep and ADHD. So it might help, but the studies weren't very clear on if it did help. So it's just something researchers are discussing, but it's a bit of a question mark, and it's likely not that helpful actually, but better sleep might help. EMP Empower Plus from True Hope had a 10% reduction, so not as effective as phospholipidolurine, which was 30% effective, but True Hope was another thing, which is a multivitamin for the brain. Lithium orotate, 1 milligram a day or less, might help. Lithium is a mood balancer. It sometimes improves people's moods. But you have to be careful, because if you have ADHD and you're an adult with ADHD and you're an adult woman with ADHD who is pregnant, lithium increases the risk of autism if you're growing a new human inside your womb. Ritalin. So we will talk about Ritalin. Ritalin increases dopamine in the brain. It is a nootropic. So people on Ritalin actually are smarter than people off Ritalin. Caffeine is a nootropic. The most commonly used productivity aid is caffeine. Caffeine is very healthy for you. But Ritalin is also a nootropic. So I know people who don't even have ADHD, but they use Ritalin to improve their job performance and their ability to work for long hours and pay attention to challenging and somewhat obtuse problems that they're working on. It's generally not very addictive, so Ritalin doesn't really get too many addicted to it. So Ritalin is a thing you can take for ADHD. It reduces your symptoms by 70%. All right. So once again, all the information is linked in the description, so you can check out the studies if you want, and get some more context and details on the studies we've discussed today and the information I've brought forward. But this was the overview, and I hope it gives you some good ideas on how you can manage your case of ADHD or your child's case of ADHD, whichever the case may be. And thank you for watching the video, and have a good night. Take care. Bye.